Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future, our regular commission meeting, Monday, January 9th. We'll call the meeting to order at 3:05 p.m. First order of business, I would like to just take a moment of silence for Representative Quentin Williams, who was a member of this commission, as well as our state representative. So I just ask everyone for a moment of silence in his memory. Thank you. With that, if our clerk could just verify our attendance and that we do have a quorum.
I have an audience of 21 currently.
Okay, thank you very much. And welcome of our new members is I believe my co-chair is online, Representative Rojas.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Sorry to leave you all by your lonesome there in the room. I couldn't make it over there from a work meeting that I had here, but thanks for keeping things going and for convening the meeting. And welcome to our new members as well.
Thank you. I'll try to, I believe I've captured everyone here in a listing. I'll just kind of run through so everyone kind of knows, but because of the legislation and specifically that is representation for those that are the either chairs or ranking members of each of the committees, and with new committee assignments, there are changes that happened from this past year. So under planning and development, we have Senate Chair MD Ram, our House Chair, which is here with us here, Representative Eleni Kavos DeGraw, and Senate Ranking Member Ryan Fazio. Under our Housing Committee, Senate Chair Marilyn Moore, House Chair Jeff Luxembourg, Senate Ranking Member Rob Sampson, and House Ranking Member Tony Scott. Thank you. Under Environment, and which is just a change for Senator Rick Lopes. It's just a new committee for him. Senate Ranking Member Steve Harding, who's now a senator, so congratulations, and has previously been on this commission, and House Ranking Member Pat Callahan. And then under Transportation, Senate Chair Christine Cohen, which will be a new committee for her. Senate Ranking Member Tony Wong, who's also a new committee, and House Ranking Member Kathy Kennedy. So we welcome all the new and returning members. And next on the agenda is our approval of our December 5th minutes, which were included in the packets that were sent out to everybody. Do we have a motion to accept the minutes as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion, corrections? All those in favor, just signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you. Is there any opposed? And is there any abstentions? Okay, thank you. The minutes are approved. The next order of business is our working group presentations. As we stated at our last meeting in December, that each of the months we will have one of the working groups present their plan in full. Last month we did have a summary of all of the individual work groups. And today we are going to be reviewing the state and municipal statutory plan process. In doing that presentation on behalf of the work group is Rebecca Auger, who's a policy development coordinator at the Office of Policy and Management. So bear with us. We do have a slideshow presentation, which will be shared screen. And Rebecca, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay. First slide, please. All right, so
Thank you. I'm going to walk through some basic information first. As far as the charge of the C&D Plan Working Group, its membership and the process that the group went through to arrive at its main recommendations, and then some related recommendations that were not necessarily a part of its original charge, but that featured highly in their discussions and they felt they needed to make some recommendations on. And then we're going to end specifically with some recommendations for this legislative session. Next slide, please. So just to orient everyone, Public Act 21-29 specifically requested input on the state's plan of conservation and development, which is known as the Conservation and Development Policies Plan, or C&D Plan, which is how I'll refer to it moving forward. Just to give you all a quick background on the C&D Plan, the first comprehensive plan for the state was adopted by Governor's Executive Order in 1974. It was after that in 1976 that the General Assembly formally established the process for adopting a statewide conservation and development plan. And since that time, over the course of several decades, the General Assembly has added particular areas of concern that need to be addressed by the broad scope of the C&D plan. In 2005, though, the General Assembly made some more significant changes, not only to statewide planning, but also regional and local planning processes to focus around 6 growth management principles that were established through the 2005 to 10 C&D plan. Those same growth management principles are the framework for your current C&D plan, which has changed really very little since 2013. In fact, the current iteration was prepared in 2017 to cover the 2018 to 23 planning period, but was not adopted until 2022. And so its planning period was extended to 2024. So while the main recommendations of the working group really focus on the C&D plan, in the course of discussions, regional and local planning kept coming up. And so there are some ancillary recommendations regarding regional and local POCDs. Next slide, please. The working group consisted of a wide variety of individuals. It was chaired by Representative McCarthy Vahey. Members came from local planning and zoning commissions to members of the business community, municipal and council of government staff, and it included several certified planners working at all levels of government and in the private sector. Next slide. The working group really started its process, as I think many of them did, by listening to those with relevant experience. And specifically, the working group invited OPM in to give a presentation on the history of the plan and its process over several iterations. Also, municipal and regional planners were invited to come in and discuss how their planning processes work, the content of their plans, and how they implement their plans. From there, with the help of an intern from OPM, the group reviewed several other states' planning processes, including all of the New England states and then several others. And I think the group by and large found that planning responsibilities are structured really quite differently among states, with other states having different levels of government, including county government that had actual regulatory authority. And so it was a little bit difficult to compare apples to oranges across the United States. So then the group really moved into its own discussions and focused specifically on the need for statewide planning, who and what activities the C&D plan really ought to be guiding, how to best coordinate planning across levels of government, and how to ensure that the plan gets implemented. Next slide, please. So the main recommendations really boil down to 4, and they are to transform the C&D plan into a visionary and objective setting plan based on current data and analysis, to maintain the C&D plan as an executive branch plan with its development overseen by the continuing legislative committee and OPM, and ultimately adopted by the General Assembly, and meaningfully engage stakeholders in development of the plan, and lastly, ensure implementation of the C&D plan. I'm going to go into a little more detail on these, but again, you have the full report that was submitted to the commission that goes into greater depth. Next slide, please. So the first overarching recommendation was to transform the C&D plan into a visionary and objective setting plan. The working group really felt that this is an opportunity for the executive and legislative branches to establish a longer term vision for policy and investment. And by longer term, the group discussed 10 to 20 years, which is beyond the scope of a C&D plan. The growth management principles that I talked about before, again, should be reviewed and amended since they haven't been updated since 2005. And they really should help frame that vision around natural resource conservation, economic development, and fiscal impact, housing, transportation, infrastructure, resilience, sustainability, and how all of those areas are really interconnected and integral to our overall sustainability. The current CD plan includes very little analysis. It incorporates other state agency plans by reference. The working group felt that it was important to rely on agencies as well as other levels of government to supply pertinent data and to analyze overarching trends and conditions in order to identify and prioritize objectives. The objectives that the plan sets out should be realistic targets for the C&D plan timeframe, which is still recommended to be a 5-year planning horizon, and that those objectives connect state policies to local action and include benchmarks to track implementation. The policies and objectives should establish the outcomes sought from the state actions, including funding, without necessarily dictating how state agencies and others should achieve the objectives. Rather, the working group really wants to encourage creativity and flexibility in the methods used to achieve objectives. And then we're going to talk about COGS again in a moment, but the recommendation was to encourage earlier involvement of COGS and municipalities in developing the plan and increasing resources for COGS to help connect state policy to local action and reinforce that towns can choose their own priorities and activities, but that state resources and support would be directed to those activities called out by the C&D plan. Next slide, please. The second overarching recommendation was to maintain the plan as really a joint effort between the executive and legislative branches. The working group debated a little bit whose plan should this be, but they felt that ultimately it was important that the plan be a joint effort in order to foster greater commitment to it and its implementation. So OPM should continue to draft the plan through a transparent and iterative process with the continuing committee and really actively engaging agencies and stakeholders in that process. But the General Assembly should maintain the authority to adopt the plan. The working group did recommend perhaps statutory changes to avoid what happened with its current iteration where the plan wasn't adopted until 4 years into its life cycle. So potentially adopt statutory changes to establish an automatic approval process after a specified time if the General Assembly hasn't acted on a draft plan that was recommended to it by the continuing committee. Also, the plan really should hold state agencies accountable. The continuing committee and OPM should really hold state agencies accountable for its implementation through regular monitoring. And the plan should guide COGS and municipalities in their own planning and land use decisions, even though it's really directed at guiding the state's actions. Next slide, please. The third overarching recommendation was to engage stakeholders in a meaningful way and process. Again, to foster commitment to the plan itself and to its implementation, the working group felt it was very important to engage stakeholders along the way throughout the process. And so the legislative and executive leadership needs to be engaged early in the process. If they are going to set out a vision for the long term, they need to really be engaged. And then OPM needs to enhance its collaboration with state agencies to help understand that vision, that policy vision relative to trends and conditions. The involvement and cooperation of all state agencies really is critical to analyzing the interconnections of current trends in the environment, land use, economy, and others, and developing that prioritized, reasonable set of objectives. Finally, OPM should use technology to conduct a more transparent and accessible process for developing the C&D plan. Experience with the last couple of plans showed minimal input was gained through the traditional posting of a draft and then holding public hearings on that draft. So the working group had several specific suggestions, including developing a website, holding periodic feedback sessions with stakeholders, and perhaps a formal referral process on a draft plan to gain input from municipalities and COGS. Next slide, please. The fourth overarching recommendation was to ensure implementation of the plan. The working group felt strongly that the desires for a more meaningful C&D plan, and a meaningful plan is one that's specific enough to guide implementation while also remaining flexible enough to accommodate changing conditions. Some of the specifics around this are the working group felt that COGS have an important role to play in implementation. So the general feeling was that the C&D plan is setting out statewide objectives. However, regions are maybe in a better situation to form the shape of how to achieve those objectives. And so in order to help move that along, the working group recommended some additional duties for COGS, including requiring consistency between their plans, regional plans of conservation and development, and the C&D plan, meaning a formal review process by OPM. There's currently an informal review process. Further, COGS should review local POCDs as they do now for consistency with regional and state plans. All plans at every level of government should include greater reporting on implementation of objectives from their prior iterations. And again, COGS and municipalities should have access to state funding only for projects that are consistent with the C&D plan. Again, local projects that are inconsistent are not prevented. However, state resources will be provided only to those that are supported by the C&D plan. Finally, for ensuring implementation, the working group felt it was important for the continuing committee to stay engaged in the C&D plan during its implementation, rather than it being a once every 5-year opportunity for the committee, that they should hear on a regular informal basis, perhaps once or twice a year, on implementation from state agencies, especially, what are they coming up with as programs and opportunities for implementing the plan? What hurdles are they facing? In addition, OPM should publish an annual performance measurement report in cooperation with other state agencies. Next slide, please. So in recognition of some of the shifting of responsibilities, especially having to do with COGS, some related recommendations, which aren't necessarily about the C&D plan itself, came up. The first being to fiscally support an enhanced role for the COGS in connecting those statewide objectives to local action through monitoring and implementation of the C&D plan. The second was potentially offering a local option for municipalities to adopt their regional POCD as their local POCD. So rather than having to go out on their own every 10 years to go through a planning process, if they felt that the regional POCD accurately and adequately reflected their own objectives, that they could just adopt that as their own POCD. Next slide, please. And then finally, the working group talked about a few changes that could be done this session just to help with the upcoming iteration of the plan, which is to address the 25 to 30 planning period. They acknowledge that more changes may need to be made, but these might help as they really are geared towards milestones set up by the statutes for the next plan. So the first recommendation is to amend section 16A-27 just to streamline the intent and purpose of the C&D plan to fall more in line with the recommendations that we just went through. The second is to amend section 16A-28 just to adjust some planning process milestones, not delaying the next plan by any means, but really just to accommodate that greater stakeholder engagement early in the planning process. and with a more transparent and accessible process, maybe shorten the final public engagement around that final draft and revision period. The continuing committee would still have to hold a public hearing and recommend the plan to the General Assembly, as is in the statute now. And those were the main recommendations, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that, and a special thank you to the entire working group that has gone through all of this. Before we just get to questions, I did want to offer Representative Kirsten McCarthy-Vahey, if you had any comments you wanted to make as you chaired this working group.
Mr. Huff, thank you very much for the opportunity, or should I say, Mr. Chair, forgive me, for the opportunity to comment. More than anything, I'd just like to thank Rebecca Auger and OPM, as well as all the members of the working group. I've been really grateful and proud of the process, though we did have a diversity of members who participated in different ways. Some were much more involved in the process and in the conversation. And I do just want to, just picking up on that very last comment about the suggested change in the process. Though there is a timeline compression, I think that Rebecca was right in emphasizing that the hope is in additional ability to be transparent and gather feedback, as we've learned during COVID, right, in some of the ways that we have using Zoom and other electronic means to be able to get a broad diversity of stakeholder input, I think is really important. I also think, as the chair of the P&D committee, and I see two former chairs of this committee here on the Zoom today, I think that having a plan that would be deemed approved without action is actually a very good idea. If it's a plan that we want to be used, and that's the whole idea around this process, is at this point, our state plan of conservation and development has been kind of a nice document, but we're not really using it effectively to its greatest ability. And some of these recommendations really push us in that direction, to be thinking across agencies and vertically aligned through levels of government. So again, thank you very much to Rebecca for leading the charge and putting the report and everyone's ideas together, and my wholehearted thanks to every member of the working group.
Thank you, Representative. Appreciate it. So with that, I want to ask if any of the members have any questions for Rebecca on the presentation, or anything from that committee's report that has been sent out to everyone prior.
Francis Pickering raised his hand in the Zoom.
Thank you.
Oh.
Francis.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. I guess one question I would have is, it's heartening to see more emphasis on planning, but I'm concerned about the resources at the state level. Also, if we're tying investments to what's in the plan, who will make the determination about consistency of a project with the plan? And what do we do in the event that there is, for instance, a conflict between a state funding program, what a program will fund and its statutory intent, and what's in the plan?
So as far as state resources, I think that was acknowledged, that it may be difficult to achieve all of the recommendations with current resources at OPM and other agencies. As far as who determines consistency with the C&D plan, even now it's on agencies themselves to determine consistency. I think the working group was suggesting that it's not difficult to achieve consistency with the current plan because of the way it's structured. However, if we have a plan that has much more specific and detailed objectives, then it would become more of a process for agencies to ensure that their actions, their programs, the funding that they award others is in compliance with the C&D plan. And I forget the last question.
Well, so what I was trying to get at, perhaps I wasn't clear, was that state agencies develop their own plans and their own programs. The legislature crafts funding programs And hypothetically, let's say there were an opportunity for the state to land a major employer, and that employer is cited or designed in a way that is in conflict with the C&D plan. One way to achieve that would be to amend the C&D plan to accommodate that, but the process probably will not be expeditious enough to make that work. So I'm just concerned that, we may have an excellent plan, but if we are too specific, we could bind ourselves in ways that lead to unintended consequences.
So one aspect of the plan that the working group just did not have the time to really get to was the priority funding area map. And I think that is something that the working group decided needs to be figured out in the process of developing the next plan. So if the plan is really guiding state actions primarily, then say a large employer wants to locate in the state, it would be about, what is the state offering? What is the state doing infrastructure wise to help entice or bring that employer? And is that consistent with the C&D plan? I think the way it's established now through the priority funding area map and the text of the plan, it's a little bit difficult to see what the state's real objectives and priorities are. And so the working group was trying to get to a point where the plan is clearer on what are we prioritizing and what are we going to put our resources into. And I think it was acknowledged that we would need to figure out how to do that through the course of this planning process that is recommended.
Yes, understood. Thank you. My last point is that if the plan becomes clearer about its intent, where it becomes, it's not as easy to reconcile projects with it, that it may become significantly harder to get a plan adopted because there will be winners and losers. There'll be trade-offs that different people may have different opinions about.
That's right. And I don't think the working group was unaware of that. But I think the idea and why there's so much emphasis on the COGS and the regional plans is to help with that. So that if the C&D plan is really just trying to set those overarching objectives and priorities, then the regional plans can dig down at that more fine-grained level on how to achieve those objectives. And so I think the working group was really calling for maybe a little shifting of the planning framework within the state to use the COGS better as a way to get at implementation of statewide objectives. And hopefully that would help with the buy-in to the process.
Great. Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Rebecca. Is there any other questions here in the room? David.
So this is David Barkin. One thing I think it's important to do is define some of the terms like, and maybe it already is in the report, stakeholders is one that constantly comes to mind. Who are the stakeholders in the context of this? Because it could be everybody in Connecticut, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's the COGS, or maybe it's the legislature and the executive branch and the office of the governor, as part of the executive branch. I mean, it's just because I'm struggling that myself on various fronts, but so I think it's important to define that. That's one comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I hope it's better defined in the report itself, but yeah, stakeholders means a wide variety. So everyone from, the governor's office down, and includes the councils of governments, the municipalities, but also advocacy groups that are constantly interacting with state agencies. And they have knowledge and data that should be brought to the table as well. It is set up now for anyone from the public to be able to comment, and of course that would continue. But as far as the stakeholders that need to be meaningfully engaged, the primary focus is on the continuing committee, the executive branch agencies, COGS, municipalities, and then stakeholder groups that are, concerned with the areas of concern of the plan itself.
Thank you. Another thing that occurred to me while you were making the presentation was when you, and in response to Francis's comment about if something's like non-compliant, there's some kind of, so it makes me think like, well, who are the granting agents? You have DECD, housing, other agencies. How do you create like a solid mechanism so that even, because those things are negotiations, especially with DECD. An employer wants to come in, maybe they want to go to one place, but there's a better opportunity. How do you bake that into their processes so that they comply then with an improved plan?
So I think the working group's focus was that the agencies would need to figure this out for themselves. So the plan would help set the overall vision of what are we trying to get to, what are we prioritizing in our objectives, and then DECD, DEEP, DOH, DOT, you tell us how to get there in your programming. But the agencies themselves would need to figure out, what do we do if we have, a business that we're trying to get to a certain location, but it would rather go here? Is it compliant or not? And if not, how do we work with that business to try to get it to come in compliance with the C&D plan? I don't think the working group was looking to have the C&D plan dictate at a very fine grained level actions specifically.
The only reason I bring it up is because if you don't do something like that, you end up with like what you have with school grants. If somebody's not on the priority list, then they get a notwithstanding clause passed by somebody, and it just it subverts the intention of the plan. So, for what it's worth.
And I think the working group recognizes that and realizes that that's what happens now with the C&D plan. But the C&D plan, as written now, really isn't specific, nor does it prioritize any of the objectives within it. And so you can cherry pick that my project is compliant with this particular line under growth management principle number 4, without thinking about how it connects with any of the other growth management principles. And so the idea is to try to get that to a more specific level where, we're saying that this is our top priority for the next 5 years. And you tell us how you're going to get us there.
Thank you.
Martin, Tim Hollister has his hand raised.
Yes, Happy New Year, everybody. Rebecca, this is Tim Hollister. One of your slides referred to towns not being able to access state money unless the proposal is consistent with the plan. I guess my basic question is, does the working group intend that to be a change to past practice or a continuation of past practice?
I think the working group felt it would be a change. It may not be change that is apparent in statutory language, but in all practical purposes, the working group intended for it to be a change in practice. So in other words, there are some provisions now where towns would not have access to discretionary state funding. For example, if they don't have their own POCD updated, however, in practice, that is rarely invoked. And so the working group intended for there to be a change where state funding really is devoted to projects that are compliant or programs that are compliant with the C&D plan. That is revamped and more specific.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Thanks, Tim. Are there other questions or comments?
Lauren, I see Betsy Gara has her hand raised.
Hi,
Good morning. Good afternoon, Betsy.
thank you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Representative Rojas. I did, as you know, towns are very supportive of efforts to develop and comply with the state plan of C&D. I do want to just express some concern about the discretionary funding and the link to that, because one of the things we've been hearing from our members for several years now is that they rely on predictable revenue streams. And even though discretionary funding would be along the lines of the competitive grant programs, when they're moving forward with a project, it is very helpful to know the extent to which they're going to be accepted in terms of their grant application. And so I would be concerned about anything that may interfere with that or interfere with the timing. Is this going to create any delays in getting money out the door? Because as we know, several types of building projects are season sensitive, and you need to get those done in the spring and the summer and so forth. So you have to be careful when you're tying compliance to discretionary funding, because there are a number of discretionary grant programs that towns rely on to comply with state and federal mandates, such as programs under the Clean Water Fund, where they are required to reduce phosphorus and nitrogen levels. They may be under a consent order with EPA. So I think you just have to be careful about that. And I'd be happy to work with the group to just make sure that there's no unintended consequences by looking at that.
Thank you, Betsy. And as I know you're aware that the municipalities also have to deal with discretionary funding provisions now with their local municipal POCD. So this was, I believe, looking at tying it into the state as well. So that's definitely, further consideration as we go through this process. So thank you for those comments. Anyone else on for?
Rep McCarthy Vahey has her hand raised.
Thank you. Representative McCarthy Vahey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Ms. Gara. It's very nice to see you. And I think your comment actually underscores exactly why we had that conversation within the working group, because there may be projects that a municipality seeks to undertake that actually might exacerbate or make worse some of those very problems that you were just talking about, for example. And to that end, if the state plan considers those and a town doesn't want to, for whatever reason, it was those instances that we were thinking about that, we're recognizing that in that way. But I hear what you're saying in terms of the need to craft that in a careful way so that it would be clear. But I think also, just to be kind of a little more blunt about it, sometimes we have plans and then we have projects that are approved through the bond commission, and we go forward and do things that maybe aren't in any of the plans. And to some of the earlier conversation, the point of planning is to set forth those goals and objectives. Nothing's going to be perfect. We always have to negotiate and look at, what we need to do, whether it's an economic development or, for example, a land trust or a preservation project or a housing project, whatever that may be. We have to face the needs of our communities and address those. But without a plan that has a stronger vision and I think a stronger mechanism to follow up, I think that we all lose collectively.
Thank you, Representative. Is there any other comments or questions?
Martin, Representative
Yes.
Rojas raised his hand. That's me.
We'll let you speak, Mr. Co-Chair.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Over a number of years, I've expressed frustration with the whole idea of the plan of conservation and development, largely because a lot of work and effort goes into creating it, and I don't know that anybody really complies with it at all. And absent a real enforcement mechanism, we're never actually going to get to compliance of any way, whether it's having the executive branch essentially monitor their own behavior and then excusing themselves when convenient because they want to move forward on a priority. I don't know that that's healthy for this process. And the same goes for the argument around discretionary funding. I'm sure that towns and cities are supposed to affirmatively affirm fair housing and don't. And then there's no accountability for that either. So I appreciate that the group took up this work, but I think those are still some of the recommendations that are being made here that we need to do something about that. I hope that we actually spend the time to do something about that. Otherwise, a lot of good work goes into a document and a plan that unfortunately very few people understand on the legislative side. And then, we're setting these goals and going through the effort of planning and then conveniently going around any of those plans or goals or guideposts when convenient, either for the executive branch or for a legislator who has a project in their district.
Thank you, Representative. And just, I know, just as kind of a side thought on the legislative recommendations, as my co-chair was kind of alluding to, this work group's kind of putting forth, two different buckets of legislative, kind of proposals, if you will. One is things that could be looked at for this session, which was outlined in the legislative recommendations in the last slide. And then as we've been discussing, some other items that are going to come further down the road as we continue this with our final report of this commission. So this is kind of a two-piece section of recommendations, as which some of the other committees may have as well. And I know as outlined, one of the, probably 80% of the recommendations for the session, for this are basically with some of the milestones and timeframes for this to be adopted, and then some other general cleanup type items. So I think, as we're looking at this and we're going to get into some of those legislative recommendations, for this is understanding this is one piece of it and not the full gamut from this work group, because there will be more coming down as they continue through this and as we finalize the full report that will come out of this commission.
I want to say, Anika Singh Lamar also has her hand up.
Oh, great.
Thank you. I want to associate myself with Representative Rojas's comments. I think whether you call it plan implementation, plan consistency, plan enforcement, that's got to be an important part of this conversation. One thing that I was a little bit surprised about in the report, and perhaps it's fleshed out in greater detail elsewhere, and if not, I'm more than happy to take a look at raw materials and research that the subcommittee looked at, is that you weren't able to get much out of what other states do here and what their practices are. Plan implementation and plan consistency are problems across the board in every state that does some kind of state planning. And I know that there are places that do it. I don't think anybody does it perfectly. I think it's just tough for a lot of the reasons folks have alluded to, but there are places that do it better than we do. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more, I guess, at some point about what you all came across when you were looking at other states, and happy to volunteer my own services in terms of looking at that a little more. There are states, for example, that do a better job than we do of allocating to local government's responsibility for affordable housing production, for example, that's in line with state goals. But that's not the only aspect of planning that I think where I think we can probably learn something from some other jurisdictions. Thanks.
Just to respond very quickly, I think we can provide a matrix of the states and the information that was gleaned from them that the committee looked at. I think unfortunately it came at a time when the working group was just starting to feel a little bit bogged down in looking at all this other information and maybe avoiding the real conversation about what Connecticut needs unto itself. And so there was a lot of good information on processes. It's just that there's so many different structures. And with Connecticut not having county government, a lot of other states rely on their county governments to play an important role in planning between that local and state level, that the working group took away what they could. They looked at New England states, they looked at many others. I can give you the list, but that it was at a time when they needed to move on from that conversation. So I probably just glossed over that a little too quickly, but they did spend quite a bit of time talking about processes in other states.
Great. Thank you for that. And thank you for your efforts to assist us with that process. Is there any other questions?
Francis Pickering has his hand raised.
Oh, yes, just briefly, Rebecca. Was there any discussion in the working group about whether the plan should pertain to process, output, or outcome? Because, to have a plan that has some policy goals could be very different than a plan that has, say, numerical SMART goals, right? You could say we want housing costs to fall by 30%. We want to increase mode shift by 20%, the transit. We want to preserve X% of our environment, right? You could have some numerical goals. And to date, the plan has not been numerical in that regard. And if you don't have goals like that, it's hard to monitor progress and implementation.
Yeah, so I don't think the working group wanted to get too specific as to exactly what form the objectives should be, but they should be something that is measurable, that there are benchmarks to understand progress towards them. And I think the working group felt that state agencies ought to be able to assist greatly in developing those reasonable but specific objectives, because oftentimes they're doing that themselves in their own plans. And so it's a matter of bringing that to the table and looking at them holistically to figure out what the overarching priorities are, where there is a chance to, cross-cut across different agency plans to really devote state resources to a larger impact. So I think the working group had in mind probably more data-driven objectives, but didn't want to get too specific in dictating the exact form of them.
Okay. One of the piece I'd like to do with this and it's kind of part of our next piece of 2023 legislative proposals, as it ties in with this, is included with the pack that was sent out was an Excel spreadsheet document, which has all of the work groups on it, with their recommendations and a little bit of additional information, just kind of as a flow chart, if you will, looking at these. As was mentioned in the last slide of the presentation, the ones for 16A-27 and section 16A-28, I want to just kind of review those. So if the clerk could call up that Excel spreadsheet, and then those that have it as well can do so. And it might be, I don't know if you can enlarge it just so we can see the left-hand columns, if that's possible. And I know on page 1, we just need to go down to the last one on the bottom is C and D. There we go. Yep. And so on here, and if I'm going to call on Rebecca to kind of just run through these, as these all came directly out of the work group's report. So they were just transferred over, the same with all the other ones. All the co-chairs did receive copies of this so they could just verify that. But if Rebecca, if you could just run through these and we try to just keep them kind of highlighted of what the meanings were on these, because the ones here, I think, except for the very last one, are all ones that could be done for this legislative session recommendation.
Okay, so for section 16A-27, that is currently the section of the statutes that the General Assembly has just continually added specific areas that need to be included or reviewed in the C&D plan. And so it's just become kind of a accumulation of topic areas that we would expect to be considered in the C&D plan. And so the idea was to just clean up that section to be concise and clear about what the C&D plan is to be, that it's a vision for sustainable development and conservation over a long term, that it should set measurable objectives for state investments over the short term, that encourage appropriate use of physical, natural, social, and fiscal resources, and that it's to encourage coordinated development by directing state resources that are administered to COGs and municipalities. So it's really just to clean up that section. And then if you go down to the recommendations for 16A-28, that is the section that really lays out the process milestones for adopting the C&D plan, for developing and adopting the C&D plan. And so it currently has as a milestone for the next plan, September 1st of this year, as a first draft due to the continuing committee of the plan itself. And so the idea was just to enable some more time for OPM to do some better engagement of stakeholders prior to submitting that first draft plan, So it was really just asking to push that out to December 1st of this year. And then giving, again, on the next milestone, a little more time, the next milestone being publishing a draft of the plan to OPM's website, pushing that off to May of 2024. It's currently set for March of 2024. And then shortening the public engagement period at, again, with the expectation that OPM will have involved stakeholders along the way. And so that public engagement period at the end does not need to be a full 5 months. So the suggestion was to shorten it to 4 months and then shorten the time between the end of the public engagement and the final revision to the continuing committee from 3 months to 2 months, still getting that draft to the continuing committee by December 1st of 2024. So just small tweaks in the process milestones.
Great, thank you. And to reiterate, doesn't change the final dates of anything. It's just adjusting the timelines within to complete those duties. As we have pushed it out 1 year, it's just that timeline stays the same. It's just adjusting, in that period up into that point.
And then the one final recommendation under that was to require action by the General Assembly on the C&D plan that is formally recommended to them by the continuing committee. The working group threw out within 3 months. There was some debate around that. I think the intention is just to require action within a certain time frame. And if no action is taken, then the plan is assumed to be approved.
And I believe that language is used in other reports as well and throughout the General Assembly. That if it doesn't wind up being that it's considered approved. So that's becomes more of a standard to the other pieces. Okay, thank you for that overview. Any questions on any of those? Okay, not seeing. So the next steps here. Well, let me just go back to the agenda. Sorry. So thank you for that update and all that information, Rebecca. Greatly appreciate it. And again, to the full work group. You have the schedule on the agenda for February, March, April, May for each of the additional work groups for presentations to the full group here. So next month will be model code and design development. So on business, 2023 legend, as we know, we have from the presentation and the review that we just went through some recommended legislative proposals that could come from this commission. These recommendations that were outlined would be recommended to be sent to the Planning and Development Committee for their review and submission into a bill. For that. And that would be the ones outlined as we had just gone over. If you looked on the spreadsheet there, obviously knowing that there's additional ones to come forward. So we can either so inclined if anyone would like to make a motion to such effect or anyone would like to discuss and then make a motion.
Chairman Heft, this is Tim Hollister. May I
Yes, Tim.
chime in? Yes, I'm just, with apologies, just focusing on the recommendations that are listed under affordable housing plans. And I think whoever prepared that list misunderstood what we reported on last time and what is now listed as our recommendation. That is our checklist for use by the municipal groups that would be preparing the plans. We actually had developed a separate list of legislative recommendations, and we're intending to finalize those hopefully at a meeting this coming Thursday. But what is listed there is not intended legislative recommendations. It was a committee checklist when they're redoing their affordable housing plan. So if that was not clear, I apologize, but those should not be taken as sent and should not be sendable right away to the P&D committee for legislative proposals. Just want to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you. And just to also clarify, we'll make sure that's clarified on that. And the only ones we're talking about for P&D right now are the ones that are listed under the C and D that we just discussed. All the others, obviously, we have not reviewed yet through all the reports, but we will update that affordable housing section there once we get your recommendations in. Any discussions, thoughts on proposal to send these recommendations from the C&Ds that we discussed to planning and development? Everybody's quiet today. Sure. Representative.
I think seeing no questions at this time, it would be wise for us to move to put those into the Planning and Development Committee.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Seconded. This is Representative Scott.
Thank you, Representative. So it's been moved and seconded to take the recommendations as outlined regarding the state plan and to send those to Planning and Development. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we will do a roll call vote. So, Mr. Clerk.
Also, for the people on Zoom, when you are responding, make sure that your camera is on, and I will need to see you to have your vote recorded. Representative Rojas,
Yes.
Martin Heft,
Yes.
Senator Needleman, Anika Lamar,
Yes.
Donna Hamzy, Steve Kleppen,
Yes.
Lamont Daniels, Kylie Goslin,
Yes.
Benjamin Winograd,
Yes.
Gregory Ugalde,
Yes.
Francis Pickering,
Yes.
Elizabeth Gara,
Yes.
MD Raman,
Yes.
Rep Kavros DeGraw,
Yes.
Senator Fazio, Senator Fazio, Representative Zulo, Senator Lopes, Representative Gresco, Senator Harding, Representative Callahan, Senator Moore, Representative Luxembourg,
Yes.
Senator Sampson, Representative Tony Scott,
Representative Tony Scott, yes.
Senator Cohen,
Sorry about that. Yes.
Representative Lamar,
Yes.
Senator Wong,
Senator Huang says yes.
Representative Kennedy,
Yes.
Timothy Hollister,
Yes.
Aaron Kemple, David Barkin,
Yes.
Alexandra Dom, Jennifer Perry,
Yes.
Randy Pincus, David Elder.
Yes.
And that's it. Oh, Senator Fazio,
Yes.
and that's the full roll.
Is there anyone that did not vote that was possibly missed over or that was called and then missed their turn? Just want to make sure, because I know we called some people that are on, but do we have everybody? Okay,
I believe we have everyone.
okay. And so all of them were affirmative votes.
Yeah.
So the motion passes. Thank you very much. So moving on, then, as you'll see, and we will make that correction. Thank you. On the affordable housing side, we'll make that correction to that report. And if anyone sees any others within their work group to do so, you know, please let me know and we'll make sure those are updated. Review of our timeline, which we just leave there as a standing item on the agenda, is that by July 1st is to review all the recommendations, which you'll see from previously on our schedule of January through May of reviewing all of this, having a draft report by September 1st, a final report by January 1st. Our next commission meeting will be February 6th, and as noted, will be a presentation from Model Code and Design Development. Before we go to public comment, is there any other business to come before the commission? Seeing none, do we have any public comment? Have anyone signed up?
No one signed up for public comment.
Okay, thank you. With that, then, it is 4:08 p.m. and I would take a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Lots of
Second.
lots. And a second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very
Aye.
much. Have a wonderful rest of the day.